Hans von Spakovsky. Mr. von Spakovsky is a 1984 graduate of Vanderbilt University School of Law. He received his Bachelor of Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1981. And he has a wide range of experience in election-related issues, including campaign finance reform, voter fraud, and enforcement of federal voting rights laws, as well as election administration and voting equipment standards. His advice has been sought by organizations such as the Commission on Federal Election Reform, organized by President Jimmy Carter and Secretary James Baker. Mr. von Spakovsky was a member of the Federal Election Commission, where he worked in the agency responsible for enforcing federal campaign finance laws for all congressional and presidential elections, including the Presidential Public Funding Program. Prior to working at the FEC, Mr. von Spakovsky served for 4 years as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Justice, where he provided expertise and advice on voting and election issues, including enforcement of the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act of 2002. He served as a member of the first Board of Advisors of the EAC, which advised commissioners on the administration of the Help America Vote Act. He also served for 5 years as member of a county board that was responsible for administering elections in the largest county of Georgia. Prior to entering public service, he worked for 17 years as a government affairs consultant in corporate legal department and in private practice. Mr. von Spakovsky has published articles in the Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard, National Review, and Human Events. He testified before state and congressional legislative committees, as well as made presentations to organizations such as the National Association of Secretaries of State, the National Association of State Election Directors, and the Federalist Society. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Hans von Spakovsky.
Well, it's very nice to be here. I've known the Blackwells actually since before I came to Washington in 2001. Just to answer a quick question, I know you hear my name and you think, well, he's not from around here, and I have to admit that's true. I was actually born and raised in Alabama. I'm here today to talk about litigating elections, the campaign process in 2008. Charles de Gaulle once said that he'd come to the conclusion that politics was too serious a business to be left to politicians. After working on election issues in Washington for 7 years, I would change that a little bit to say that I think politics is too serious a business to be left to lawyers. But that's unfortunately what has happened. Ever since the Gore v. Bush decision by the Supreme Court in 2000 and the passage by Congress of a new federal law governing elections, the Help America Vote Act, 2002, there's been this tremendous increase in election-related litigation. And I think it's something that threatens our election process, the democratic way that we choose our leaders. There's been a couple of studies done on this. From 1996 to 1999, so before the 2000 election, there was an average of only about 96 election-related lawsuits across the country in state and federal courts. From 2001 to 2004, that jumped to 254 cases a year on average, so a 2.5-time increase. There was another study done looking at pre-election litigation, and in the 2000 year, there were 48 of these lawsuits. In 2004, there were 114. What's happened here is that, frankly, the political left has figured out that it's to their advantage politically to try to change the rules under which we register to vote and under which we vote and under which we count the votes before an election, because it's easier to try to alter the outcome of an election before it occurs than to contest it afterwards. And this substantive change, not only has there been this huge explosion in lawsuits, but before 2000, most election-related lawsuits were post-election contests. You know, it was a losing candidate going to court and suing, saying there was something wrong with the election and he should have won. But what's now going on, has been going on for several years, is that the vast majority of this litigation is filed before the election. Right now, we're, 2-3 months away from the election, and there are federal lawsuits pending all over the country that have been filed by the ACLU, the NAACP, the Brennan Center, which is this organization at NYU Law School. And these lawsuits are contesting voter registration rules, the kind of statewide voter registration databases that states have set up, standards for voting machines, etc. Basically, a lot of these lawsuits, I mean, in my mind, I think are ridiculous suits, but these days in federal court, they are sometimes successful. Obviously, the judges don't listen to me, but you know, that's a problem. I want to give you an example of the kind of suits that are pending. I mean, for example, can you imagine prior to 2000, the ACLU filing a lawsuit contesting that the kind of voting machine you use is potentially a violation of your constitutional rights? Well, no. Well, they have suits like that pending in Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and several other states. The Bush v. Gore decision, I think, has prompted this explosion of litigation, and also I mentioned the Help America Vote Act. As you know, in 2001, after the 2000 election, election reform was the big issue. Congress was talking about it, the media was talking about it, states all over the country formed task forces to look at it, because everybody was saying, well, we don't want to have a repeat of what happened in 2000. Well, the end result of that was that Congress passed this new law called HAVA. As you know, in Washington, it's all acronyms. That law was kind of unique because we've always had a very decentralized election process. You know, in federal elections, the federal government doesn't run elections. There's no federal agency in Washington that runs elections all over the country. Elections are run, even federal elections, by the more than 3,000 counties all across the country, and even down to the municipal level in some states like Michigan. In fact, before the Help America Vote Act was passed, running federal elections was probably the oldest unfunded mandate in American history. What Congress did when they passed the Help America Vote Act is they set out a series of requirements for the for the states. For example, they said that every state has to set up a statewide computerized voter registration database. A lot of states didn't do that. A lot of states had their voter registration lists according to counties. And so in some states it was actually easy to be registered in more than one county in the same state, because you could get registered in a county, move to another county, get registered in that second county, and there would be no communication between the two counties. You could be easily registered in two spots. Another thing that the Help America Vote Act did is they required all states to offer provisional ballots. Does everybody know what a provisional ballot is? Well, one of the big issues that came out of Florida in 2000 and other states were claims by people saying, well, I registered to vote, but when I went to my precinct to vote, my name wasn't on the registration list and I couldn't vote. And, you know, there were some claims like that that turned out to be correct. You know, occasionally what would happen is people would go in and register to vote, try to register to vote when they went and got their driver's license. And the Driver's License Bureau, for whatever reason, administrative error, wouldn't forward that documentation to the state election officials. The person would get registered. So Congress said, okay, to prevent that from happening, people not being able to vote because of an administrative error made by state authorities, every state has to offer an individual who comes into a precinct to vote. And if that person's name is not on the registration list, if that person claims that they're registered to vote and they're eligible to vote in that precinct, then they have to be given a provisional ballot. In Virginia, in Fairfax County, for example, where we vote on electronic machines, they're supposed to hand you a paper ballot. You vote. They then segregate that ballot. They put it in a separate envelope. And what will happen is after Election Day, the local county election officials will look at that and try to determine whether or not your vote should be counted or not. Did you really attempt to register, and did the county authorities make a mistake? If they did, they'll count your ballot. But if they determine that you never actually really tried to register, they don't have to count it. Well, that lawsuit prompted that provision prompted a whole series of lawsuits in the 2004 election by the Democratic Party. And what they did is they filed suits in the battleground states of Ohio, Missouri, Florida, and Michigan. And in those lawsuits, they claimed that Congress, when it passed the HAVA law and when it put in this provisional balloting requirement, overrode the traditional state rule that we have precinct voting. You know, you have to vote in the precinct that you're assigned to based on your residence and where you live. And what the Democratic Party did when they went to court is they tried to say that states have to count provisional ballots no matter where you go vote. So that meant, for example, that if you were registered to vote in Vienna, here in Fairfax County, but you were down in the southern part of the county and you wanted to vote in a precinct down there, not only would they have to give you a ballot, but they would have to count it. Now, in several states, the trial judges, it was actually kind of funny. It tells you something about how federal district judges change. In 2 states, the federal district trial judges said, no, Congress didn't override state-based precinct voting, and no, you have to give the person who shows a provisional ballot, but if they're voting outside their assigned precinct, you don't have to count it. 2 judges in 2 other states, Michigan and Ohio, and these are federal judges who have been appointed by Bill Clinton, said the exact opposite. They said, oh, no, it's very clear Congress overrode traditional precinct-based voting. Fortunately, this ended up in the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals 1 week before the election, and the 6th Circuit said, no, Congress did not override state traditional precinct-based voting. Now, the court actually laid out a very good analysis of saying why this would be a bad idea, because it would be much tougher for states to prevent double voting, people voting in their home precinct and then going and voting someplace else in the same county. It would be very much tougher to prevent ineligible voters from coming in. A whole series of reasons for it. I'm not sure what kind of a comment it makes about the people that the Democratic Party believes are going to vote for them, that they're so afraid they won't be able to figure out how to get to their own precinct. But I'll leave that for others to say. The thing about this provision is, this was supposed to solve some of the problems that arose out of the 2000 election. Well, what was the biggest problem in the 2000 election, right? It was the Chad fight in Florida. And what happened? We had the results of the presidential election delayed for more than a month while we were doing recounts of punch card ballots in Florida, trying to determine, I was one of the volunteers down there, trying to determine whether or not each individual ballot was a vote for Gore, a vote for Bush. Well, look, in 2000, only about 28% of the United States used punch card ballots. Well, now in the United States, 100% of the country has to provide provisional ballots. And I'll guarantee you that if we have a close election this November, in any state in which the number of provisional ballots handed out is within the margin of victory, there will be lawyers in every single county in those states watching as election officials the day after the election open up every provisional ballot, investigate, decide whether or not that ballot should be counted, and then fighting over whether the ballot should count or not. And we could have an election result delayed for a long time. In Los Angeles County, which is the largest county in the country, they, on average, hand out hundreds of thousands of provisional ballots during every election. So we could have an unbelievable fight because of this. The other lawsuits that are going on that have been filed by the ACLU and other organizations are lawsuits aimed at trying to prevent states from checking the accuracy of their voter registration lists. Okay? And let me give you an example of this. One of the things the Help America Vote Act did, which was a good thing, was they said that they changed the voter registration application that you fill out. All of you, I know, have filled this out at one time or another. It's a one-page form. You put on your name, your address, your birth date. Well, they added something to it. They said when you register to vote, you also have to put on there your driver's license number, if you have a driver's license, or the last 4 digits of your social security number. And then they said what the state is supposed to do with that information is they're supposed to check it against other state databases. What that means is if you register to vote and you put a driver's license number on it, they're supposed to then run that driver's license through the DMV's database and see if the name assigned to this driver's license number that's on the voter registration application matches the name in the driver's license bureau. And that way you have a way of checking to make sure that the person who's registering to vote is really the person they say they are. Because if Joe Smith says he's got driver's license number XYZ, but when they check XYZ in the DMV, it's assigned to Julie Brown, well, then you know there's a problem, right? Well, the ACLU sued the state of Washington for doing that kind of matching and refusing to register to people to vote when there was a discrepancy. And a federal judge actually issued a preliminary injunction saying, yeah, I don't think you can do that. That kind of a discrepancy is not material to the situation. And instead of appealing the decision, unfortunately, the Secretary of State, a Republican, in Washington settled the case and agreed to allow people to register to vote even when there's no matchup between the information. The ACLU then took that settlement and went to a whole series of other states and threatened to sue them if they didn't stop their matching program. And so the states of California, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Texas, North Carolina all stopped doing that matching. Now they filed the identical lawsuit in Florida. Federal District Court issued a preliminary injunction again. That was appealed, fortunately. It was overruled by the Court of Appeals, and they remanded it back to the state. But that lawsuit is going on right now. You see what's going on here. They're attacking the ability of states to try to make sure that the voter registration lists are accurate and that there aren't any fraudulent names on those lists. That's at the beginning of the voting process. At the end of the voting process, what they're doing is, as you know, they have filed lawsuits contesting the ability of states to require voter ID when you go in to vote. Now, that's something that's overwhelmingly approved of by the American people, and that goes across racial and ethnic lines. Every poll on this shows, 70, 80% approval rate for this. Blacks, whites, Hispanics, everybody thinks it's a good idea, except for the Democratic Party and all these liberal advocacy groups in town. Indiana passed the strictest voter ID law in the country. It was upheld by the Federal District Court, it was upheld by the Court of Appeals, and it ended up before the Supreme Court. Fortunately, the Supreme Court in April issued a decision, 6-3, saying that voter ID is constitutional. Now, what was interesting about that decision was it was clearly just a shock to the left that the Supreme Court came back and approved that law. But what shocked them even more was that they expected that if they would lose in a 5-4 decision. The conservatives on the court, the four conservatives, and the swing voter, Justice Kennedy, they expected 5-4. But what was great about this decision was it was a 6-3 decision, and the lead decision was written by Justice Stevens, who, as you know, is a very, very liberal justice. But what the liberal groups who had brought the lawsuit all forgot was that Justice Stevens came of age professionally in Chicago. Okay, so he actually is a justice who understands that voter fraud does exist, and he wrote the decision on this case, which was very great. Georgia also passed a voter ID law. That also has been to federal court. It has been upheld, and the most interesting thing about both of these two cases is that in both lawsuits, after 2 years of litigation, despite claims by the plaintiffs that there were hundreds of thousands of people without voter ID, both judges noted in their decisions that in 2 years of litigation, the plaintiffs couldn't come up with a single individual, not one, who didn't either have an photo ID or couldn't easily get one. And not only that, but in the Georgia case, the NAACP, they couldn't come up with a single member of their organization who didn't have a photo ID or couldn't easily get one. And that was one of the reasons the cases were thrown out. But again, you see there's an attack on trying to have accurate elections when people go in to vote. The other big issue, and this is unsettled, and actually if you want to know more about this, I've been writing papers recently for the Heritage Foundation, and if you go to www.heritage.org and plug in my name, you can find some of the papers I've written. We have a problem in this country with non-citizens, both illegal aliens and people who are here legally, registering and voting in our elections. Because right now, election officials have no way of preventing that. And there are incidents from all over the country showing that that is occurring. The only state in the country that has done something effective about this is the state of Arizona. Arizona passed a referendum in 2004 that requires you to present proof of citizenship when you register to vote. And what's interesting about that is that they did it through a referendum. The state, the people of the state of Arizona overwhelmingly passed this requirement, even though almost every single elected political person in the state, including the Republicans, came out against the law. That, of course, a lawsuit was filed claiming it was discriminatory and unconstitutional. The federal district judge refused to issue a preliminary injunction. She let the law go into effect, and they just had a trial literally that ended a couple of days ago on that lawsuit. If it's upheld, I can tell you that other states will start to do that. The Speaker pro tem in the Georgia House of Representatives, who I know, has already told me that he's going to introduce a bill like that in Georgia, and he wants me to come down and testify in January about it. And that's another thing that needs to be done. But again, it's going to be fought by the left. I don't want to take up too much time. The other lawsuits I'll tell you about just really quickly is a lot of states have tried to pass laws that tightened up the rules for third-party organizations doing voter registration drives. And the reason for that is because, for example, most of you probably heard of ACORN, which is this organization on the left that does voter registration drives, and they've had dozens of their employees convicted for voter registration fraud all over the country. They've also had problems with some of these organizations going out, doing a voter registration drive, and then instead of taking the filled out forms and immediately getting them to election officials so they can process them, getting people registered, hanging on to the forms. There have been incidents of these organizations hanging on to these forms for months, and by the time they get them to the election officials, the deadline for registering to vote is passed. And so you have these people showing up at the polls thinking they're registered to vote, and they're not. So a number of states like Ohio, New Mexico, Florida put in, for example, they try to put in deadlines saying that if you're doing a voter registration drive, within 10 days of getting the form filled out, you're supposed to turn it into election officials. ACLU sued, saying that's a violation of their constitutional rights to have that kind of requirement. The state of Ohio said, okay, your voter registration employees aren't doing a very good job. Before they can participate in one of these voter registration drives, you want them to undergo some training. It seems like a pretty logical, common sense thing, right? Preliminary injunction issued by a federal judge, that's a violation of the constitutional rights of that organization. So once again, you can see all these lawsuits by the left trying to prevent any measures to tighten up the rules when it comes to voter registration drives. The end result of all this is that you more and more have courts, federal judges getting involved in the rules and dictating how people get registered to vote, whether they have to show ID or not. And I don't think that's a good thing for our election process, because it means you have federal judges more and more involved in deciding election outcomes. And I don't think that's good for our election process. I don't think that's good for public confidence in our elections. And again, I can guarantee you that if we have a close election, what happened in 2000 will be nothing to what will happen in November, because Barack Obama, one of the first things he did as a lawyer in Chicago was he represented the organization of ACORN, the one I was just talking about, And I'll give you just one quick example of the way the Obama and his lawyers are willing to twist and take advantage of the system. You may not have heard about this, but in the Ohio Democratic primary when it occurred, on Election Day, Obama's lawyers went to court, federal court, in Cuyahoga County, which is one of the biggest counties in the state, and they made a claim that the judge should issue an order extending the polling hours because there was bad weather in the county and people couldn't get to the court. There was really nothing to this lawsuit. None of the polls were closed. None of them were out of ballots. There was no reason to be in federal court, but unfortunately they persuaded a federal judge to issue an order extending the polling hours. Now, the funny thing about the order, if you actually look at it, is that there must have been microbursts of really bad weather in that county, because instead of extending the polling hours of all the polling places in the county, there's a handwritten list of about 20 polling places. By an odd coincidence, they're the polling places where Obama had been polling the strongest against Hillary Clinton. And that's the kind of tactics I can tell you we can expect to see in the November election. I'll end this by saying that I think we should be doing everything we can to get the courts out of the election process. I don't think, unfortunately, that's going to happen, but I'm hoping that we don't have the kind of contested election coming up in November that we had in 2000, but I'm afraid that if it's close, it may be much worse than what happened before. Thanks. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
We have mics for you as well. Go ahead. One second.
Let's see. Is there any chance? Oh, thanks. Is there any chance that absentee ballots are not counted, or when are they counted? And is there in various states, particularly Virginia, is what I'm interested in.
I don't know specifically the rules in Virginia. I'll tell you that the rules slightly vary from state to state. For example, in Georgia, they don't count the absentee ballots until the end of Election Day. And they they passed a law some years ago in Georgia that allow them to start opening up the envelopes, slitting the envelopes at 5 o'clock on Election Day, but they can't actually start counting until later. It kind of varies from state to state as to when they count it, but I'm not aware of any state that counts absentee ballots before Election Day, and that, of course, would be a very bad thing to do. The problem with absentee ballots is that they are the tool of choice of people who want to steal elections. And there is case after case after case of elections being stolen in this country through absentee ballots, including one of the biggest examples of it is the Miami Herald won a Pulitzer Prize for covering and investigating the 1997 mayor's race in Miami, which the results were thrown out because of 5,000 fraudulent absentee ballots. And the trend in the states to no-fault absentee balloting and all mail ballots is a really bad trend that's not good for our system. Yeah.
I was a treasurer for Fairfax County Republican Committee for 8 years, and I found dealing with the FEC to be a real problem. My take is that we should abolish it, and we should simply require that all contributions be immediately given out to the public, and that any problems should be referred to the Justice Department. Your comment, please, sir.
Well, I actually agree with you. And for those of you who don't know, I was on the FEC for 2 years in a recess appointment. My regular nomination I was not confirmed in my regular nomination because the Democrats didn't like me so much they refused to hold a vote on me. And I'll tell you, after 2 years being a commissioner there, I completely agree. I think what we ought to have is full disclosure of contributions received by candidates and full disclosure of expenditures And I think that would be a good system. And actually, we had a pilot run of this. I don't know if you all realize this, but the FEC was actually shut down for the first 6 months of this year because the Democrats hated me so much that they were willing to shut the agency down rather than confirm me. And so in this past December, there are 6 commissioners on the FEC. It takes the votes of 4 commissioners to take any action. And the recess appointments of myself, 2 other Democratic commissioners all ended, and they only had 2 commissioners. So for the first 6 months of this year, the FEC was unable to operate and could not take any actions. However, during that 6-month period, everyone running for Congress, everyone running for the presidency, continued to file their monthly disclosure reports, just like they're supposed to under the law, and our system didn't fall apart. So I actually think that was a good test of how that system would work, and I can't say I disagree. Yes, ma'am.
What percentage of our population go to the polls to vote? The second part of the question, how are we going to educate the populace to vote and how to do it intelligently? I'm thinking of the 18-year-olds. What are we doing in the schools to educate the youngsters, who in turn can also help to educate the parents?
Well, I'm trying to, in the last election, 2004, we had the highest turnout in, I think, in about 30 years in the presidential elections. I forget the exact number. It was over 60%. So that's 60% of eligible voters. So, that's actually, I think, a pretty high percentage. The people who turn out the lowest continuously in every election are people 18 to mid-20s. And yeah, I think civic programs in schools are a good idea, but I got to tell you, my experience with this is, my observation about this is that I think the reason a lot of people don't vote when they're college age and right after is because they're busy getting an education, then they get out of school and they're busy getting a career established, and it's only as they get older and they start paying taxes and they settle down that they start realizing that actually they know they need to vote because who they elect is going to affect their lives. And I'm not quite sure what you can do about that, because consistently every election, no matter what kind of education we do, the biggest group that doesn't vote is that younger age group.
Up on that. 50 years ago, I had the opportunity of setting up a brand new high school in New Jersey. Our history department taught history. They also taught the elections. We set up in the high school a mock election. They ran it. The students ran it. We brought in the voting booths. We worked with them for about 2 weeks, ran the thing as a mock election 1 week before the election, and then compared those results with the voting in the district. The parents were also educated through that experience.
I think that's a great idea. Question over here.
I think we're aware of the advantages of voting, say, on a Saturday or Sunday or both. What would you see as the disadvantages, possible fraudulent situations might come up if we allowed voting on the weekend?
That idea gets proposed a lot, but I can't remember the name of this, but there was a study done some years ago that actually took a look at that idea, because there are a number of other countries around the world that do that, and frankly, the end result of the study was that the authors concluded that did not make a significant difference in getting people to the polls. A couple of years ago, there was a good book came out in the U.S. that did an intensive study on turnout. And the idea that people don't vote because they can't get to the polls is just not the case. the biggest reason people didn't vote was because they just weren't interested in the election. And the idea they couldn't get to the polls was at the bottom of the list. So I frankly don't think it would make a significant difference.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much. Just a moment. Hans, I've been trying to think of some easy way to describe this phenomenon of the left trying to use the courts to shut down any efforts to prevent abuse. And it has occurred to me, maybe we should describe it as the termites going to federal court for injunctions against the Orkin guy. And as a token of appreciation for your presentation, let me present you with one of the Leadership Institute's Adam Smith ties. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are interested in purchasing Adam Smith ties, Adam Smith scarves for the ladies, other Adam Smith merchandise, I would invite you to go upstairs to the 5th floor, talk to my assistant, Kathy Graham. Kathy, are you in here? There she is. She will be happy to show you what we have, and it's high-quality merchandise. I invite you to join us here next month, Wednesday, September 3rd. Unfortunately, I will not be here because I'm going to be in Minnesota with my wife at that time. But we will have a superb speaker here, one whom I know you will enjoy greatly. Our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast speaker is John Taylor, who is president of the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. He's an enormously active and colorful person, and you're going to find his presentation very interesting. And now, if anyone is interested in a tour of the building, we're always happy to do that. Amy Selman, Amy, step up here if you would. She is going to lead whoever might be interested in a tour of the building. And I thank you for coming today and look forward to seeing you again on frequent occasions.